I'm a big fan of Robert Eggers. He's got vision, he's got a voice, and I like what he's done so far. The Witch was a good film, The Lighthouse was excellent, and The Northman was a thrilling action revenge experience. When it was announced his next project would be a Nosferatu adaptation, yes, of course it's exciting, it's right up his street, and you do find yourself wondering what he could do with such material. I'm sure it would be a great movie. However, there was an element where I was a bit like, another Dracula movie? How many of these have we had? How many times can the same story be told? I'd much rather he lend his talents to original, new, fresh ideas like he's been doing. And to summarize my review, that's pretty much my overall thoughts on the movie. It's a great film. I had a great time with it. Between the original, Werner Herzog's movie, and this, Eggers' film is probably my favorite of the Nosferatu movies, maybe even one of my favorite Dracula movies, period. Or at least one of the first I'd show someone who is not familiar with the story, because of course it's fresh and modern. But I couldn't escape a feeling while watching it that what I was seeing was completely redundant. I mean, it isn't, it's simply a retelling of a story that's been told many times and will continue being told many times, but I just felt like, well, I've seen this play out before. There's not going to be any major surprises, is there? And there wasn't. I get that this must have been a passion project for Eggers. I get that. It must have been something he's wanted to make for a long time. I appreciate that. I'm happy for him, and it was a great film. But now that he's done it, he's got it out of his system, I'd much rather what he does next is not an adaptation of an already well-known story or some big IP. The movie even seems to play with the assumption that you're already familiar with the story. For example, I know it was briefly depicted in a picture, but I don't actually remember anyone saying that the vampire's weakness is sunlight, which it is. There's little things like that where it makes the movie feel like Eggers is saying, I know you already know the story, I just really wanted to tell it, so here's my version. Although just thinking about it, I think they mention in the movie that it's the fact that the vampire isn't back in his grave before dawn that kills him, not the actual sunlight, but it doesn't make much difference. So what's left is the ability of the film to convey a captivating narrative in spite of pretty much everyone watching knowing the story inside out. And it does a good job, I have to say. The movie has a moody, gothic atmosphere about it, the actors are all pretty good, and all in all it's a fairly conventional, straightforward telling of the Dracula tale, with one small twist in the story, but well told. In fact, this movie succeeds where many previous renditions of the Dracula tale have failed for me. You see, whenever I watch a Nosferatu movie, I always find the first act of the film is the most interesting, when our young, dashing, ill-fated Jonathan arrives at the castle and meets Dracula. It's always interesting seeing each filmmaker's different interpretation, and here it was done really spookily, the atmosphere of the castle. What will Dracula look like? How quickly will our hero realize things are not quite right? When the action leaves the castle and Dracula rushes west to get some sweet punani, that's where the story usually slows down and gets a bit boring. He'll disappear from the film, we'll spend time with cannon fodder, maybe Van Helsing might get introduced, and all that happens here. And yet the stuff that happens after we leave the castle is actually where the film is most interesting. I kind of felt like Nicholas Holt's journey and time at the castle was rather by the numbers, aside from it looking really nice. But when all that was over, when guys like the ever-durable William Dafoe are introduced, the film kicks up a few gears. Much of the film really, the middle section especially, is a kind of Exorcist-style possession movie, with the young woman of the movie, played by a Lily Rose Depp in good form, withering around and chanting demonic rhetoric as those around her desperately try to find a solution. She was actually scarier in the film than Count Orlok himself. Ultimately, I think it is a solid entry into the Dracula collection. It'll be one where people say, oh, that was one of the more prettier and gothic ones. It's a pretty period piece and has a nice atmosphere. Within his own filmography, I actually think it might be the least interesting of Eggers' films, but that's only because the story is already so well known. Maybe he was too respectful of the original film, as you could easily describe his version as a cover of the original. It's definitely inspired by silent era horror, and one could criticize the picture by saying it didn't feel like a fully formed artistic take on the original, just a homage or update. I think, for example, to Luca Guadagnino's remake of Suspiria, a film he clearly loved and cherished, but the remake is completely different in style to the original Dario Argento version. As you'd expect, the film does well with the lighting, shadows and cinematography, going toe-to-toe with the 1992 Dracula movie even maybe. There's a lot of haunting and ethereal shots in the film. The Count himself was well done, hidden in the shadows in the beginning of the film and slowly revealed over the course of the movie. I like that they gave him a moustache in this interpretation. It reminded me of pictures of the actual Vlad Dracula the Impaler. But the movie's prettiness aside, there isn't that much more that's deeper, like say The Lighthouse, where the cinematography and the atmosphere is beautiful, but in that movie it almost feels like a character unto itself. Nosferatu touches upon things, like Defoe talking about how the Enlightenment and science has actually blinded people to the very real dark elements that exist around us. But it's all very surface level, and it doesn't feel like there's a point much, or a theme to what you're seeing, except for it all to be just digested at a sensory level. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but I know this filmmaker is capable of more. It felt a little safe, like it could have been a lot more bonkers and out there, like his previous work. Again, for better or worse, it feels like Eggers just really wanted to make a Nosferatu film. I think I would have preferred a movie that was perhaps based on the Nosferatu story, but one where he had the freedom to deviate and a story that wasn't chained to a well-known, unchangeable narrative. There was one thing that made me scratch my head a little. It's that twist in the story I mentioned, revealed in the film's first scene, where it turns out that Nosferatu was awoken and summoned by the young woman's call or prayer. She is then plagued by him in dreams and visions for her entire life until she meets her eventual husband, but then the visions come back when Holt is set to leave for the castle. Whereas traditionally, the Count was in the castle and took notice of the woman when Jonathan Harker speaks to him about her in the castle, or the Count sees her image in a locket or something. In Francis Ford Coppola's version, for example, she reminded him of his old love in his previous life. But here, it was her who essentially summoned him in the first place, years back. So, was he actually dead and she brought him back? Or was he revived by the devil, as Defoe's character says? And why did he stop coming to her when she marries Holt? I'm guessing the film is saying that their pure love was power enough to keep him at bay, his evil at bay. But I guess what I'm saying is that it's a small few changes that causes a pretty big deviation to the story, where rather than it all be happenstance, in this movie Holt's character is essentially being set up from the beginning by his employer, who is one of the Count's cronies, presumably going to the castle so he can be bumped off. It seems in this interpretation there were some ancient laws of some kind that prevented the Count from going after the girl so long as she has a marriage contract. Orlok respects the ring, I guess. But that was pretty much the only real deviation from the traditional classic story I noticed. So all in all, it's a good looking movie, but is that enough to call it a good film? I'll let you decide that in the comment section below. John Walters once said, "I believe if you come out of a movie and the first thing you say is the cinematography was beautiful, it's a bad movie." I wonder how relevant that is here. I can see some people describing this film as all style and no substance. Others will say that the atmosphere is the experience, that's the entire point of the film. I guess it depends on what kind of film watcher you are. It could even depend on what mood you were in when you watched it. Thanks for watching.